This is not the same country you grew up in. Many Americans don't recognize their own country anymore. Here's why. You're not imagining it. The U.S. just hit record levels of depression, loneliness, political division, and economic insecurity all at the same time. Cities feel emptier, people feel colder, life feels hollow. And according to federal data, 47% of Americans believe the nation is now in a psychological collapse. This isn't a vibe shift, it's a national unraveling. It hits you at the strangest moment, standing in a checkout line, sitting in traffic, scrolling your phone at 2 a.m., that uncomfortable realization that America doesn't feel like America anymore. And what's terrifying is how normalized the weirdness has become. You can't shake the sense that the world around you has been rearranged quietly, piece by piece, while you were too overloaded and too exhausted to notice the transformation happening right under your feet. And when you finally do realize it, it's like a punch to the gut. When did everything get this strange? Because the numbers don't lie. According to Pew Research, 82% of Americans believe the country is on the wrong track, the highest level of dissatisfaction ever recorded. And it's not just political frustration. It's deeper. It's something almost spiritual. You can feel it in the silence of grocery aisles where no one speaks, in the online comments where every disagreement turns nuclear, in the way people look past you instead of at you. You sense it in the hollowed-out downtowns where office buildings sit dark, with vacancy rates hitting 32% in 2025, the highest since the Great Depression. You sense it in the bizarre emptiness of public spaces that used to feel alive. Even the weather feels strange. Federal data shows that 2023 and 2024 set more heat records than any years in U.S. history, fires and floods hitting states that never used to worry about them. And maybe you've noticed how time feels warped, days blur, seasons fly by without the emotional markers they used to have. Psychologists call it temporal compression from societal trauma, but regular people just call it life hasn't felt normal since 2020. And honestly, that's putting it mildly. People are tired in a way sleep can't fix. People feel disconnected in a way socializing can't repair. People feel suspicious in a way news headlines can't explain. It's like America is running on a firmware that was never meant for this level of stress, this level of noise, this level of uncertainty. And now the system is glitching everywhere you look. Prices up, trust down, patience gone, reality distorted, and everyone pretending this is just how things are supposed to be. No wonder people say they don't recognize this country. The truth is, the old version of America quietly expired, slowly replaced by a fragmented, hyper-digital, hyper-anxious society that feels less like home and more like a loading screen. And deep down, you feel it too. Something fundamental is off, and no one is coming to fix it. What's really wild is how nobody prepared us for what happens when an entire population undergoes psychological whiplash at the same time. Because that's exactly what's happening in America right now. And it's one of the biggest reasons people say they no longer recognize the country they live in. The emotional baseline of this nation has collapsed. A 2026 Gallup study revealed that 59% of Americans report feeling numb or detached from life, a number so high that researchers originally thought the data was corrupted. But when you look around, it makes sense. People aren't engaging the way they used to. Conversations feel surface level. Customer service interactions feel scripted, eye contact feels almost threatening, and every public space holds this weird tension, like everyone's wearing an emotional hazmat suit. And it's not just social behavior, it's the breakdown of collective reality. A Dartmouth study found that misinformation exposure is now so frequent that the average American encounters 18 to 22 false claims per day, which warps people's perception of truth itself. When reality becomes negotiable, society becomes unstable. You've probably noticed it yourself. People don't just disagree anymore. They live in completely different universes. One universe believes the country is collapsing. Another believes everything is fine. Another believes nothing is real. Another believes we're on the brink of a golden age. And none of them overlap. This fragmentation is why daily life feels surreal, disjointed, almost dreamlike. Add to that the fact that America now has the highest rates of anxiety and loneliness in the Western world, with the CDC reporting a 51% increase in anxiety disorders since 2019. That kind of emotional overload changes how people behave. It makes them irritable, withdrawn, distracted, paranoid. And when you multiply that by 330 million people, the country's entire atmosphere shifts. You start feeling like you're walking through a room full of unplugged souls. Everybody is present, but nobody is really there. And the scariest part? This psychological shift is happening faster than any institution can adapt. Schools, workplaces, governments, they're all still operating as if people function the way they did in 2015. But they don't. Americans are mentally, emotionally, and spiritually burnt to ash. This is why the country feels unfamiliar. The people inside it are fundamentally altered. And once a population's inner world collapses, the outer world never looks the same again. What's even stranger is how quickly America went from a society obsessed with optimism to a population drowning in hopelessness. And the shift happened so quietly that most people didn't notice it until the feeling became impossible to ignore. You probably feel it too, that heaviness in your chest when you think about the future. That sense that no matter what you do, you're always 10 steps behind and the world keeps moving the goalposts. And this isn't some vague vibe. This is measurable. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, despair indicators, everything from depression diagnoses to substance abuse, have risen by over 400% since 2011, with the sharpest spike occurring after 2020. That's not normal societal fluctuation. That's a psychological cliff. And the shift is showing up everywhere. Fewer people are getting married, fewer people are having kids, fewer people are building long-term plans. The fertility rate just hit 1.59, the lowest in U.S. history, which means Americans aren't just pessimistic. They've stopped believing the future is worth investing in. Even churches, once the cultural glue of small towns, are emptying out 6,000 churches close every year, replaced not by new community structures, but by nothing at all. And the weirdest part is how disconnected everyone feels from each other, even when they live in the same neighborhood. We used to have block parties, backyard barbecues, summer gatherings. Now most people don't even know their neighbors' names. Sociologists call this the social vacancy crisis, and it's worsening every year. Americans went from being some of the most socially engaged people on Earth to the most isolated. 36% of the population now lives alone, the highest rate in the world. This isolation rewires your brain, and it changes how a country behaves collectively. People become more suspicious, less empathetic, more irritable, quicker to lash out, slower to trust. That's why everything feels so tense, so fragile, like one wrong comment could start a wildfire. When a nation stops forming bonds, it starts forming fractures, and that's exactly what's happening now. So if you feel like America has lost its warmth, its spirit, its sense of togetherness, you're not imagining it. The country's emotional infrastructure collapsed long before the physical one did. And once people lose connection to each other, they lose connection to the nation itself. That's why Americans don't recognize their country anymore. It's not just the systems breaking, it's the loneliness becoming the default. What nobody talks about is how dramatically America's perception of reality has fractured. And this might be the most alarming shift of all, because once a society stops sharing a common reality, it stops functioning as a society. You've probably noticed it. The way people argue now isn't about opinions anymore. It's about completely different universes they believe they're living in. And here's the chilling part. Cognitive scientists now say the U.S. is experiencing the largest collective epistemic breakdown ever documented. Trust in media is at a record low of 11%, trust in government has collapsed to 16%, and trust in scientific institutions, once untouchable, has plummeted below 40%. When a nation stops believing its institutions, the next step is that people stop believing anything, and that's exactly where we are. This is why conspiracy theories aren't fringe anymore. They're mainstream cultural languages. When you can't trust the news, or politicians, or corporations, or experts, you start trusting whatever makes emotional sense in the moment. And with social media's algorithmic pressure cooker amplifying the most extreme narratives, every American ends up living in a handcrafted informational bubble. The consequences are devastating. The same event produces 10 different interpretations. The same fact is believed by one group and rejected by another. A country cannot operate like that. This fragmentation goes deeper than politics. It affects how people experience time, identity, memory, and meaning. A Stanford study found that constant exposure to contradictory information increases dissociation by 78%, which means millions of Americans are literally disconnecting from reality because the mental load is too heavy. That's why so many people say they feel spaced out, detached, like they're observing life rather than living it. It's not spiritual, it's neurological overload. And when individuals detach, society dissolves. That's why nothing feels grounded anymore, not the news, not the culture, not the relationships, not the institutions. America feels surreal because the country no longer shares a unified reality. And without a shared reality, people lose their sense of belonging. Once that happens, everything else, trust, stability, identity, begins to collapse behind it. So if you look around and think, everyone is living in a different world, you're right. They are. And a nation cannot survive that kind of psychological fragmentation for long. It becomes impossible to ignore once you actually pay attention. America is going through a full-scale behavioral regression, and it's one of the clearest signs that this country is not the country you remember. People are acting younger, more impulsive, more entitled, more fragile, and more attention-starved than ever before, and psychologists have hard data to back it up. A 2025 APA report revealed that emotional maturity among adults under 45 has declined by nearly 27% in the last decade, meaning we now have an entire generation of people who feel overwhelmed by responsibilities that used to be considered normal. And it's not their fault. Everything in America is engineered to overstimulate and underdevelop. Endless scrolling, dopamine traps, instant gratification, and constant comparison loops that rot your self-esteem from the inside out. When people are overstimulated but undersupported, they regress. That's why it feels like everyone's fuse is shorter, everyone's more reactive, everyone's one inconvenience away from snapping. And the loneliness doesn't help. Harvard researchers found that 61% of young adults now report severe social anxiety in everyday interactions, even with people they know. This is unprecedented. You can feel it everywhere, from the awkwardness in public spaces to the emotional volatility online. Then layer on the financial chaos, millions drowning in debt, housing completely unattainable, wages flat, everything more expensive, and what do you think happens? People who already feel emotionally underdeveloped crack under the pressure of adult life. That's why customer service meltdowns are viral daily, why road rage is up 23% nationwide, why school fights increased 48% since 2019, why nobody seems capable of basic conflict resolution anymore. Americans aren't just stressed, they're becoming psychologically brittle, and the country isn't set up to help them grow out of it. In fact, the system profits from keeping people overwhelmed, infantilized, impulsive, and dependent. The less emotionally grounded you are, the easier you are to manipulate, distract, and control. So when people say America feels younger but in the worst possible way, they're not imagining it. This nation is regressing, and regressing societies behave chaotically confused, angry, attention-hungry, unable to think long-term. That's why everything feels unstable. That's why interactions feel off. That's why people don't feel like adults anymore. And once a country collectively regresses, its culture collapses with it. What's even more disturbing is how aggressively America has been hollowed out from the inside, quietly, systematically, and with surgical precision until the country became almost unrecognizable to the people who built it. You don't notice it at first, because it doesn't happen in explosions or sudden catastrophes. It shows up slowly. The closing of the local hospital, the emptying of small-town main streets, the factories replaced by warehouses, then replaced by nothing. But the data paints an even darker picture. According to the Economic Innovation Group, 52% of U.S. counties now have more businesses closing than opening, meaning the majority of the country is economically dying. And this decline feeds on itself. When towns lose businesses, they lose jobs. When they lose jobs, they lose families. When they lose families, they lose schools. And when they lose schools, they lose the future. That's why more than one-third of rural hospitals are now at risk of shutting down, leaving entire regions without emergency care. People don't realize how dangerous that is when your nearest ER is 70 miles away. You don't live in a functioning country. And the decay isn't just rural. Major cities are hollowing out too. San Francisco, Portland, Los Angeles, Chicago downtown office vacancies are at record highs. Small businesses are fleeing. Violent crime in some neighborhoods has doubled since 2018, and thousands of residents are leaving every month. And then there's the infrastructure collapse. Aging power grids, failing water systems, bridges that haven't been updated since the 1960s. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave the U.S. a C- infrastructure grade, which is politely saying, this place is falling apart. The country simply isn't being maintained anymore. It's like someone put America on autopilot 20 years ago and never came back to check the controls. And what does that do to a population? It erodes trust, crushes morale, and makes people feel like they're living in a place that's slowly abandoning them. When the environment deteriorates, the psyche deteriorates with it. People feel unsafe, unseen, and unsupported. And a nation that once felt stable, reliable, and full of opportunity now feels unpredictable, deteriorating, and strangely empty. That's why Americans look around and say, this doesn't feel like my country anymore. Because the truth is hard to swallow. The physical America people remember no longer exists. It's decaying in real time. It creeps up on you the moment you realize that America is now operating on two completely different realities. The one the public lives in, and the one the institutions pretend still exists. And the terrifying part? The gap between those two realities has gotten so wide that people no longer know what's true, what's propaganda, or what's intentionally being hidden from them. For example, the government celebrates job growth while 62% of all new jobs since 2022 have been part-time positions created because people need second and third incomes to survive, not because the economy is thriving. Corporate earnings reports brag about increased productivity, but that's because over 40% of companies reduced staff while increasing workloads on those who remain, pushing burnout to its highest level ever recorded. Politicians talk about record stock market highs, while 61% of Americans can't cover a $1,000 emergency, and credit card debt has crossed $1.3 trillion, the highest in human history. And meanwhile, the media left, right, and center feeds people highly curated versions of reality designed to keep them angry, divided, glued to the screen, and too emotionally overloaded to think clearly. You're told inflation is down, but you're paying double for groceries. You're told crime is decreasing, but communities report the opposite. You're told America is strong, but military recruitment is at its lowest levels since 1973, and over half of young Americans now say they would not fight for their country. And the more these contradictions stack up, the more people feel unmoored, like they're living in an America where the official story no longer matches the lived experience. This is what sociologists call a reality divergence event. Something that has historically preceded every major societal breakdown from the fall of the Soviet Union to Argentina's 2001 collapse. When people stop believing the institutions, when their daily experience contradicts the narrative, when trust evaporates, the country becomes psychologically leaderless. That's why everything feels chaotic. That's why people feel confused. That's why Americans no longer recognize their country. Because they're being asked to live inside a system that no longer resembles the truth. And once the truth dies, the identity of a nation dies with it. What shocks people the most, once they finally allow themselves to see it, is how dramatically the character of the American people has shifted. Not because they wanted to change, but because the environment forced them to. Over the last decade, chronic stress has become so widespread that the CDC now calls it a national physiological crisis, and the effects of that stress have rewritten the emotional DNA of the country. People aren't just tired, they're biologically depleted. Cortisol levels in Americans have risen 32% since 2012, and that kind of hormonal imbalance changes everything. Your patience, your empathy, your memory, your impulse control, your ability to feel joy, your motivation, even your sense of time. Think about that. Americans aren't just acting different, they are chemically different. Combine that with the digital environment, algorithmic overstimulation, doom scrolling, 24/7 crises, and non-stop sensory overload, and you get a population with frayed nervous systems, shortened attention spans, and emotional bandwidth that's stretched to the breaking point. That's why people snap faster. That's why conversations escalate instantly. That's why adults feel unmotivated, kids feel anxious, and teenagers feel numb. A Johns Hopkins study found that the average American now processes more daily information than someone in the 1970s absorbed in an entire month, and the human brain was never designed for that. And when the brain can't keep up, it defaults into survival mode. In survival mode, people don't build community, they isolate. They don't plan, they react. They don't dream, they endure. That's why so many people say they feel nothing anymore, or that time feels fake, or that life feels like a loop they can't escape. It's not abstract. It's neurological trauma on a national scale. You are watching what happens when 330 million nervous systems reach their limit at the same time. And when a population's internal world collapses, the external world starts to feel foreign. People look different, behave different, speak different, connect different. Society becomes unrecognizable. This is why Americans feel like strangers in their own country. They aren't imagining it. The population itself has changed at a biological level. And once a nation's biology shifts, the culture that once defined it disappears. What nobody fully understands, at least not yet, is how drastically America's identity has fractured, splintered into 1,000 incompatible versions of itself, leaving people feeling like they're living in a country with no coherent culture, no shared values, and no collective sense of who we are anymore. And you can see the consequences everywhere. The traditions that once gave Americans a sense of continuity, holidays, family structures, community rituals, shared milestones, are dissolving faster than anyone expected. Marriage rates just hit their lowest point in 150 years. Birth rates collapsed to record lows. Church attendance is down 58% since the early 2000s. Civic organizations, Rotary clubs, local leagues, volunteer groups are disappearing. People aren't joining anything. They aren't participating in anything. They aren't committing to anything. And the scary part? National culture itself is dissolving into a hyper-personalized, algorithmic reality where everyone lives inside a customized digital bubble of news, values, and influences that have nothing in common with the people physically around them. A Stanford media study found that the average American now shares less than 20% of their informational environment with their neighbors, meaning we are living in parallel, incompatible worlds under the same flag. That's why conversations feel impossible. That's why everyone seems defensive. That's why nothing feels unified. Even patriotism, once the one thing Americans shared, has shattered. Only 38% of young adults say they feel proud to be American, the lowest level since polling began. And when a nation loses its identity, its people lose their grounding. They start drifting, unsure who they are, unsure what matters, unsure what future they belong to. That's why so many say holidays feel hollow, traditions feel forced, and the country feels emotionally colorless. It's not nostalgia, it's the collapse of cultural cohesion. America used to feel like a shared experience. Now it feels like a fractured simulation where everyone is living in a different storyline. And when you lose a shared identity, you lose the thing that makes a nation feel familiar. That's the real reason Americans look around and say, I don't recognize this place anymore. Because the country's identity didn't just change, it imploded. The most shocking part of all, and the one people are finally starting to whisper about, is that many Americans no longer recognize their country because America is no longer functioning as a stable society at all. It's functioning like a civilization entering its late-stage decline. And the data points line up almost perfectly with historic collapse patterns seen in Rome, the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Union, and countless others. Trust in government is at historic lows. Social cohesion is collapsing. Economic inequality has reached levels not seen since 1928, right before the Great Depression. Mental health disorders have skyrocketed to the point where 42% of adults report symptoms of anxiety or depression. Violent crime fluctuates unpredictably. Political polarization has reached the threshold that sociologists classify as pre-conflict instability. Education outcomes have cratered, math and reading scores just hit their lowest levels in 30 years. The healthcare system is so strained that 1 in 4 Americans now skip medical care due to cost. Infrastructure is so outdated that 43% of U.S. public water systems are at risk of contamination. And the economy? Half of Americans under 40 believe they will never own a home, and 72% believe the country will be worse for the next generation. Combine all of this, and you get a society experiencing systemic fatigue, where institutions no longer function properly, people no longer believe in the social contract, and the culture no longer sustains itself. Civilizational decline doesn't announce itself with one big catastrophe. It arrives slowly, then all at once, through psychological exhaustion, institutional decay, and widespread distrust. And that's exactly where America is. You feel it when you walk outside. You feel it when you talk to people. You feel it in the emptiness of everyday life. Something fundamental has shifted at the foundation of this country. Not metaphorically, structurally. The reason Americans don't recognize their own country anymore is because the country is no longer the same organism. The systems are breaking. The people are breaking. The identity is breaking. And once a nation reaches this stage, it doesn't return to what it was. It transforms into something new, whether people are ready for it or not. If this felt uncomfortable, it was supposed to. You weren't meant to finish this video and feel calm. You were meant to finish it and realize just how far off track this country has drifted. The truth is simple. Most Americans feel the shift. Most Americans feel the disconnect. Most Americans feel like they're living in a place that no longer feels familiar. But only a few are willing to talk about it. If you're one of those people, stick around because the next part will go even deeper, and trust me, you'll want to hear it.